Welcome to Mission Undercode. Joining me today is immigration lawyer Hillary Walsh. She has more than a decade of experience and has represented clients in front of the US Supreme Court. We will discuss the immigration system, its merits and its flaws, and ask the question of whether immigration law itself should be protected or destroyed. We will also discuss how our society can better support the integration of migrants into our communities. And finally, we will also talk about how to build a career in law, drawing from Hillary's experiences. Could you start by introducing yourself and explain how you got interested in the field that you got into?
Yes, I'm attorney Hilary Walsh. I'm an immigration attorney based out of Arizona. I became really drawn to immigration law when I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. Was while I was kind of doing like a volunteer project in Uganda, and I just was so drawn to seeing how difficult it was to adopt children and the complications that arose because of international human rights law.
So, what do you think about how human rights law is structured? Because there's been a lot of criticism of it, especially from voices on the right, saying that it doesn't allow for countries to control their individual borders. And there's also been criticism of it on the grounds that it doesn't really apply to all countries equally. Some countries can act with impunity on a global stage, whilst other countries face more consequences for their actions.
For the most part, international human rights is something that you opt into. It's a voluntary basis that you join various conventions or agreements, but there is kind of a baseline that all countries have to agree to, that we won't persecute, that we won't torture, that we won't do some of those, acts of war and genocide, for example. Now, the I think the most significant criticism of international human rights law is the enforcement. So you can have all sorts of different groups saying that something is wrong, and it can in fact be happening. But the enforcement of the agreements, the baseline, the we promise and we agree that we will not go below this, the enforcement of actually holding that line is very weak and very frustrating. And that is true even inside the United States, but it's definitely true on the global scale.
Yeah, that's more of a political problem than the problem of the law itself, right? Because we have these global institutions that gives more power to certain countries like the United States and other big powers over other nations. I wanted to ask you, how important do you think it is for ordinary people to understand the law?
I am a teacher at heart, and I really think that if you understand and you have some access to education, you're very empowered. If you don't know that something is wrong, then you will tolerate a lot of things. I see that a lot with clients who don't realize that they are being trafficked, that they're experiencing actual human trafficking because they have in their culture it has become so normalized to be treated that way that it's expected, but it's actually illegal. It's a federal crime. And if you don't know that because you don't know what the law is, then you can really find yourself being horribly taken advantage of, and that's not okay.
Yeah, I definitely think that people need to have more awareness about the law so that they understand if they get into a difficult situation, they understand that they have some rights as well and that their rights actually matter. Because a lot of people devalue their own rights. They might fight for other people's rights. They might think that other people's rights are important, but then they disregard their own. What's the most important piece of advice you would give to an aspiring lawyer today based on all the experience you've had?
I think that lawyers and people who are interested in being lawyers typically like to know that they know all of the information. There's something about, I now understand this, I have all the information that's available, and I've comprehended it, and now I can go apply it. I just don't think that you ever, as an actual lawyer, though, I don't think you ever reach the end of learning in your field. They call it practicing law because every day there really is something new that's developing, and it's a craft that you practice for the rest of your life. And that can be very, very tiring for people. Like, I've been an immigration lawyer for over a decade. I'm going into 15 years now. And there are days when I feel like I know nothing about a certain area just of immigration law. I don't really practice civil rights law. I don't do divorces. I don't do criminal law. I don't do all of these different types of law just within immigration. And I've only done that for 15 years. And I still feel completely ignorant sometimes. that can be a very overwhelming feeling for people where you feel like you can never master something. But you have to kind of lean into that and say, I am a lifelong learner. And every day I will be humbled by the fact that there is more for me to learn.
I think that's so important for anyone, really, because there's always something you can learn. You never maximize your knowledge. To what extent do you think that the field of law is similar to how it's depicted in TV shows like Suits?
I love Suits. I think that there's very little that's in common with it. Obviously, like the plot lines are very quick, and you get a resolution of cases within, oftentimes within one episode, and the episode is only an hour long, where I have cases that have been going on for 12, 13 years and they still haven't resolved. So that's not the majority of my cases, but never in my life have I had anything resolve within 1 hour. It is a very long process. And a lot of times in Suits, you will see some interaction with clients, but the office politics in a law firm, I'm so thankful that I've never experienced that, because that's a lot of the drama in that show is the inter lawyer and the inter staff drama.
Now I want to move to talk more about the immigration system. In your years of experience, what problems do you think that the immigration system has, and what problems have you encountered within it?
Well, I think it depends on how much time you have because there are so many problems that I have encountered, but I think the largest problem is on one hand people who are looking at the immigration problem that we have and with all sincerity saying things like why don't people just go about it the legal way? Because that really comes from a place of just truly not understanding what folks are up against. And then on the other hand, people saying, I have been a good person. Yes, I have this one mark on my whole record, which is I entered the country without permission or I overstayed my visa, but now I want to fix this and thinking that just being a good person is enough to do that. And so you're always bringing people to this harsh reality of everything is so hard. Like wherever we're at in this conversation, the whole system is very hard. And there are very few ways to fix even one slight blemish on your immigration record. It's a very unforgiving system.
And I think it's also the fact that there is a lack of safe and legal routes for people to use. And that's the main reason why there's such high levels of irregular migration. I don't know if that's the case in the US, but it's definitely the case in the UK. And that's why the government is looking to introduce more safe and legal routes to reduce the amount of people taking these dangerous and risky, in our case, small boat crossings, and in your case, border crossings. What do you think about something that I advocate for? I think that our government should pursue a policy called a yearly migration plan, which a think tank in the UK has recommended. It's like a yearly budget, right? So our migration policies would be based on evidence, the needs of our economy, and the capacity of our public services. So labor shortages and all those different things that should be considered when making immigration policy, which are currently not considered because there's so much focus on political rivalries and political messaging. And I think that it really should be based on evidence. And based on that, we should be determining how much people we want to come into our country.
I completely agree with that. I think that immigration is a political issue and it's been a politicized issue, and it's actually a question of economics. And if we just use data, I mean, the UK has the same problem that we have here in the US, which is, I mean, the problem that's almost global, which is declining birth rates and an aging workforce. So all of a sudden, all of us are going to find ourselves in a big vacuum where we have all these folks who are retiring, all the baby boomers are retiring, and needing healthcare workers to help take care of this really significantly large population. At the same time, all those jobs will become available to people who are going to be close to my age, who I will be taking care of our elderly parents while also raising our children. And then there won't be enough jobs. Employers will have to pay a lot more money to people like me to be able to do this job. Meanwhile, we don't have enough children because it's so expensive to have children. We don't have enough children to be able to backfill essentially, and our populations decline, and then less money is circulated and so on. So I completely agree that this should be something that we look at. I don't know if it's annually, but I do think that you can I know how many babies were born. I mean, I don't know right now off the top of my head, but you and I know We can find how many babies were born in the United States 20 years ago. So I can tell you how many kids are entering the workforce, young people who are entering the workforce right now, either going to university or going into their first jobs. And we know we don't have enough of those people in the UK, just like in the United States. So the math is already there. We need to use our head instead of politics.
That's such a good point because the very same people that want to lower immigration are the very same people that are calling for higher birth rates. And we've seen clearly that countries that introduce pro natalist policies that are trying to introduce higher birth rates have resolutely failed to do so. Despite introducing such vast financial incentives, their birth rates still haven't increased. So I think it's clear that we do need some level of migration and we need to base that on evidence, based on the demographic crisis. Because if we reduce migration substantially, then in the future we're going to just face societal collapse because we're not going to have enough workers to sustain our economy. Another
Absolutely.
thing I wanted to ask you is, why do you think that migration is such a divisive issue in our society? Technically, it shouldn't really be such a divisive issue, but I think that the amount of migration has been somewhat too high, even though right wing voices have exaggerated the extent of that. I do think that it has had an effect on our public services and also on our communities.
I think that so much of what we see in politics in general becomes an us versus them. And when we can create a common enemy within a party, that's the best thing that any politician can do. And so rather than necessarily making it about in our country about the left, we can have the right talk bad about the left and the left talk bad about the right. But the easiest thing to do is to create this other enemy. And they are the ones who are taking your jobs, and they are the ones who are committing all of these crimes, and they're the ones who came in this country and shouldn't be here to begin with. And a lot of those people also happen to be people of color. And so it prods at an underlying problem that we have in the United States that England has as well. I used to live in England, so I have a little bit of experience with it. Um, is we have a racism problem. We have a racism problem that,
Yeah,
as
definitely.
much as we're trying to overcome it as a society, no society is innocent. Everyone has unclean hands when it comes to racism. This is a problem that we should be able to talk about openly. We should work to eradicate. But if underlying they're the enemy is also look and they're also not white people, that is a I think another ingredient that really makes it where it's them versus us.
Your analysis is so good because there's actually so much evidence of this. Because back in the days of Brexit, political forces were using Polish people and Eastern Europeans as scapegoats. Then they moved to brown immigrants after EU migration dropped. And now that overall migration has fallen significantly, they're moving to a new scapegoat of welfare claimants and disabled people. So I don't think this type of politics will ever stop. So what we need is a collaborative approach to politics to make sure that we're actually working to improve people's lives and actually work for the priorities of the people rather than scoring political points against each other. What do you think that governments should do to make sure that these migrants that are coming in are better integrated into society? Because often they don't really know English, and if they have been accepted into society, they are unable to find work because they lack skills sometimes as well. And do you think that asylum seekers, whilst their claims are being processed, should be allowed to work? Because currently that's not the case in the UK.
I mean, I think that I have to go to the core of your question, which is, and perhaps disagree with it or at least question it. Do we need people to assimilate? I think that's the word that we mostly use in immigration law in the US, but you're using the word integrate. I wonder what integration means. I say this very rhetorically, and so it makes me wonder, what is it that we're wanting people to do if we're wanting them to be more like us so that we feel more comfortable with them, so they're able to work, so they're able to, you're using the word integrate into society. It makes me question whether that is still having an underlying us versus them. I think that other
Yeah, I
cultures,
think it does,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I
I
don't mean
understand
it
where
in
you're
that
coming
sense.
from, though. I
Yeah, I don't
totally
really
I
mean it in that sense. I more mean it like they can, for example, get
function.
work, send their children to school, get a house, have a place in the community, basically. But right
Absolutely.
wing voices would say that cultural integration or something like that. But I don't really agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting. Some of the very fibers that the US is really big on what American culture is and how important that is. And it would be very, I think that every person you talk to in the United States might have a different opinion on even what culture is. So,
Yeah,
on what
exactly.
our culture is, right? But it definitely would have Bud Light and an eagle involved, and maybe the American flag as well. So, anyway, Coors Light is still trying really hard to win that spot. Look, it is so important when we think of how do we want to treat our neighbors. I think that's the easiest way. If my neighbor moves in and they're brand new, I don't go over and wonder, do they speak my language? Do they look like me? Etc. And so how can we extend those courtesies to other people who are new folks? And it is a huge challenge to move in somewhere and not know like I've lived in Korea, I've lived in Japan, and I've lived in England. My experiences in Korea and Japan were very challenging because I don't read any of the symbol based languages that are Japanese and Korean. So I would be like looking at a map and trying to do this like matching game. It was very difficult. And I stuck out like a sore thumb because of how I look. But it was so interesting. I got to the UK and I had such a culture clash with the UK way. And I have a family member there who calls me a Yank because I love to do everything last minute. Where in the UK, everything has a booking. Even getting your
Yeah,
oil
definitely.
changed has a booking. Opening a bank account has a booking. These are unheard of things in the United States. Everything is walk in, everything is drive up, 30 minutes and you're out of here. So anyway, the the right to work and to take care of yourself and the ability and the pride that so many people like I rarely meet a person who doesn't want to be able to provide for their own family. I rarely meet a person who doesn't want to pay for their kids' food. Everyone wants that gratification. And I think that our governments should work to allow people to have that.
Yeah, we definitely need a more humane approach because everything is currently about demonizing and vilifying. And I think we need a more human centric approach to this. My final question on this issue is, do you think that we should have offshore processing, like asylum seekers should be able to apply for asylum and apply for refuge from outside the country that they wish to go to? Because currently, people who apply for asylum to the UK have to be on UK soil. So that incentivizes people to make dangerous crossings across the English Channel, to make illegal and irregular migration. So I think that it would be really helpful for our system if we allow migrants to claim asylum from embassies, consulates, and any other offshore areas to make sure that they can actually access safe and legal routes easily.
Your question is so timely because last week on Thursday, so the third week of June, our U.S. Supreme Court just issued a decision that people do not have a right to seek asylum from outside the United States, even if they're at the border asking to come in, talking to a border agent and saying, I want to seek asylum. They do not have a right until they have a foot on the ground inside the United States. And so that I was on one of our news stations last night, and that's the exact same thing that I talked about, which is we're going to see an influx of people. For us, it is people hire what we call coyotes, and they're basically human traffickers, human smugglers, I should say. And the things that happen to people, the sexual violence that happen to men and women alike, to
Yeah, it's
children,
horrendous. The same thing
it's
happens in France.
horrendous. Yeah, and people will be in the back of a car and then they just get abandoned. They found the like a moving van full of people, including children, in Texas. I want to say it was about 2 years ago, and they died from the heat. I cannot imagine what that would be like and how bad it would have to be at home to say, "Hey kids, let's hop in the back of this truck and do this." But anyway, I digress. To answer your question, I have a couple clients who, way back in the day, like when I was still a teenager, applied for asylum from a UN camp in Pakistan, and they were from Afghanistan. This was at the beginning of what would eventually become the 20 plus years that all of us were inside Afghanistan. And they applied for asylum, they got asylum, and they were able to come to the United States, and they got integrated here. They lived in tents while they were there. Lots of challenges in living inside any encampment, but at least it was an option. I don't know what the UN does on your side of the world, but on our side of the world, there's really no UN setup or presence. For example, from most of the folks coming from South America, like from Venezuela and then through Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, a lot of those folks who are fleeing, there's nothing along the way for them. Every government is just kind of like, get out of here. We don't want anything to do with you. And then they wind up at the doorstep of the United States. I have found rumors, but I have not seen a lot of proof. But it sounds like Canada has a somewhat more friendly immigration system. But Canada is also very aggressively recruiting people to come to Canada because it's so underpopulated. So it's a long winded way of saying I don't know what the best solution is, but we are in the same boat
Yeah.
now as the UK where we're not allowing people to apply from outside.
Yeah. Finally, I wanted to ask you, what's one piece of advice that you would give to someone growing up in this society today? What advice would you give to a young person that's seeing all this division, that wants to make their way in the world, but is feeling really, really uncertain about things?
The voices in our head are not our voice, would be the number one place to start because I cannot control what you say, either about me or about other people, but I can control what's inside my own mind. And that's actually very hard to do because we have to be very aware of it. So we have to be aware and conscious of our thoughts because our thoughts then create emotions and our emotions create our life because it's like the vibration and frequency that we live on. So I know it's a little woo woo, but there's a lot of science that backs it. So I think that it all starts with us. And the more that we can keep trash out of the space between our ears, the better the entire globe will be because we have these spiritual connections with everyone. We are all connected somehow. I don't understand it, but I know it to be true.
That's so powerful, and thank you so much for sharing that. And that really reminded me of the chimp paradox, if you've heard of that. Thank you so much for joining me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.